Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Megan and I work on the membership team here at Bond. We're really pleased to be working with HaysMac again, who are hosting this webinar with us. Um, First, we'll quickly give some housekeeping points. The session is being recorded and will be available afterwards. Please ask questions throughout the session and pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. We'll then cover them towards the end of the webinar. We'll also be sharing a feedback survey towards the end. We'd really love to hear your thoughts and ideas for future topics, so please look out for the form. Thank you again to HaysMac, who we're lucky enough to have a long-standing relationship with. I'll now pass you to Steve Harper at HaysMac, who will guide you through scenario planning in a changing environment and also introduce you to our other speakers. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much indeed, Meg. So just by way of brief introduction, so I am Steve Harper. I'm a partner in HaysMac. I head up what we call our social purpose team, so our charity and not-for-profit team. I'm primarily an external audit partner and look after a pretty broad range of charity clients, but my big focus and passion is organisations with an overseas focus. Outside of the day job, I have also held a number of non-executive roles. I'm currently trustee and treasurer of MAP Action, which is a humanitarian charity supporting with various data science and efforts in disaster relief situations. Very, very brief background about HaysMac before we go into the session. So we are a firm of auditors and accountants, and we are specialists in the charity not-for-profit sector. So around about 30% of our work is in the charity sector, and we offer a broad range of services, including external audit, internal audit, grants and donor audits, and tax compliance. We've worked with Bond for many years now, supporting on a range of different webinars and events, and very pleased to be collaborating with Bond. And what we will always try to do on any of the sessions that we have is choose things that are very relevant for the sector at the moment. And when we were looking ahead to our program for this year, scenario planning really came out to us as being of particular relevance. If I look across my client base, it's something that we are having many conversations with clients about. It's something that our clients are having to take really very, very seriously indeed. And that reflects quite a number of things. The operating environment that many of you are working in is challenging. Clearly, we know and understand the challenges around funding volatility. Clearly, USAID being a significant part of that last year, but also the various knock-on effects, the continued challenges in UK government funding, for example. We know that is difficult, and that's kind of coinciding with other challenges around inflation, cost of living. Clearly, geopolitical instability has been high and is of course increased given the very, very difficult events in the Middle East at the moment. So many of you will be working in a challenging operating environment, and that does increase the importance of scenario planning and how that scenario planning then links to your organization's strategy, being nimble and being able to adapt in quite difficult circumstances, and then how it links to various aspects of the governance and financial governance, your annual budgets, your risk register, your financial plans, and your operational and strategic plans as well. And I think it is important that scenario planning just isn't sat in isolation, that it's something that is live and important for the organization. I think one of the things I see as really critical and important when we're thinking about scenario planning is really getting to grips with what are the key assumptions, and understanding what is a true unknown and what is a kind of known unknown, where that there is some uncertainty, but really understanding what have you assumed, be it on inflation and cost base, be it on future funding, be it on program delivery, and really being able to tease out those key assumptions, I think, is is absolutely critical. I think the real benefit of good scenario planning is ultimately being able to support decision making under pressure. And I think in this, I highlighted some of the challenges a moment ago, and in this kind of challenging and also quite quick moving operating environment, the need to make quick decisions can be significant. So I think if you have pre-agreed responses, pre-agreed scenarios that you've considered, it can help ultimately make better decisions. I know, for example, from my trustee role, that we have an established change management policy in place, and we've used that change management policy in a number of cases where there have been drops in our fundraising or other unforeseen issues, and that's just enabled us to have a framework by which we can make decisions rather than have to rush into very quick decision making without that kind of framework. So what does a good framework look like? Well, from my perspective, it's a number of things. It's having a number of distinct and plausible scenarios. That doesn't mean hundreds and hundreds. In fact, I think that's not a good kind of scenario framework, but it means considering a number of distinct and plausible things that are appropriate and relevant. It's understanding then the impact of those on both the finances, but of course on your mission and the impact on your work. And then it's really understanding the decision making and the decision implication and what that means for your organization. Example areas that you might be considering around use of reserves, prioritizing program areas, particularly if you are in a position of constrained resource, understanding what is absolutely mission critical and what is a nice to have, potential cost and cost restructuring, and then linking back to your risk framework as well. And I think if you use scenarios well, it can help with fewer surprises. I don't think it can avoid surprises. I'm not sure anything can, but it can help to reduce the surprises. I think it can give clarity on the strategy and ultimately confidence in the decisions you go through. So I don't think it makes any of this easy, but I think having a framework will help. So in terms of the objectives of the session today, we're going to try and cover a few things. So one is about how to approach scenario planning realistically, avoiding optimism bias. I mentioned a moment ago that the assumptions are key, and avoiding optimism bias in those assumptions is critical. We're going to think a little bit about some of the key trends. I've touched on a couple of them already, and then how to think about prioritizing those when assessing future risks, and then thinking about how to plan and respond for potential cuts and organizational pressures. So that's really what I wanted to say by way of very brief introduction. And my aim there is really just to set the scene of why we're talking about scenario planning, but you will each have your own sort of objectives and reasons for joining today's session. I am joined today by Matt from AMREF and Vinu from Christian Aid. We'll hand over to them in a moment, but before we do for their detailed session, Matt, firstly, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Wenham. I'm Director of Fundraising at AMREF UK. I've been fundraising in international development now for nearly 30 years. I've enjoyed a very fantastic career with opportunities to work for some great organisations. And I'm pleased to be here today to share what we've been doing at AMREF to sort of navigate these choppy waters that we're all going through right now.
Thank you, Matt. And Renu, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yes. Hi, I'm Renu, and I'm the Strategy and Performance Lead at Christian Aid. I've been working in the strategy and planning space for a while now, both in Christian Aid and previously in Save the Children as well in India. Very pleased to be here and just share our journey with you.
Thank you very, very much. So just in terms of the running order, we'll hear from Matt and then from Renu. We'll then have plenty of time at the end where the three of us can answer any questions you have. You have the facility within Zoom, the Q&A facility, to ask any questions. So please do please do pop any questions in there and we will come to them at the end of the session. But I will now pass over to Matt to kick us off. So Matt, over to you.
Thank you. There we go, just checking everyone can see that. Okay, I haven't got many slides, so don't worry about that. I'm not going to PowerPoint you to death. So thank you for the opportunity to join you today. For some of you who may not be so familiar with AMREF, AMREF is Africa's largest health charity. We're headquartered in Nairobi and always have been, and next year we'll be celebrating 70 years of impact, bringing primary healthcare closer to communities that need it. As I said, we're headquartered in Nairobi, and we're part in the UK, part of a group of offices that we call the ENAs, the European and North American offices. And our role is very much focused on fundraising and supporting our colleagues to deliver the work in Africa. One point that's really interesting from our fundraising is that 80% of our restricted program funding is generated from Africa, from the country offices, from headquarters. And that led to an interesting decision around our new strategy that was started a couple of years ago. But yeah, we're Africa-led, and our role is in the UK to be supporting the fundraising efforts to drive our mission forward. So I'll take you back to COVID and the period moving back from there. At that point, AMREF UK was in the middle of a 2023 strategy period, and in 2021 did a strategic review, sort of emerging from the challenges of COVID and sort of thinking about the risks and vulnerabilities that had emerged over that period. And it was clear that in the UK, AMREF was over-dependent on a handful of restricted grant funders, and the individual giving program, such as it was very small, and in fact was being sort of shored up by a handful of major donors. So at that point, it wasn't really clear how fundraising was sort of delivered in the team. So a decision was made to sort of reorganize the organization and to create a program funding team that was focused on restricted grants, fundraising, and a supporter engagement team that were there to drive growth in individual giving. And one of the outcomes of that strategic review and the creation of the new team was that my role was created, and I joined AMREF in 2023 at the end of that strategic period. At the same time, around 2022, our leadership in Nairobi were reviewing the new strategy and developing that, and had recognized a similar issue that during COVID, AMREF had grown rapidly, largely due to our ability to reach remote communities, and we had been partnering with 11 countries to deliver the vaccination programs. And that had attracted a lot of interest, a lot of funding, and restricted funding had grown rapidly, but unrestricted hadn't grown anywhere near as quickly. And that was an unsustainable situation. So at that point in the new strategy, it was decided that the focus for restricted grant fundraising would concentrate on the continent, and that restricted fundraising that had been held in Europe and North America would be transitioned, and the relationships passed over to either country offices or to our colleagues at HQ, and that the focus for the European and North American offices was to grow unrestricted income and grow that rapidly. So at the same time, the headquarters put together an individual giving strategy, which actually runs to 2037. So a very, very long horizon, but the ambition is to grow unrestricted income at a global level to 100 million by 2037. And so a huge amount of effort in setting up the offices to do that was taking place around that time. So the global corporate strategy launched in 2023 with a goal towards 2030. And as part of that, a restricted growth fund was developed off the back of a transformational gift from Mackenzie Scott that would allow investment in the European and North American offices to grow individual giving. And we all had to be part of an investment process where we would have to understand our markets, develop our models, and then be able to demonstrate a return on investment based on a level of investment. And that was a huge part of work that we did in 2023. And so now 6 European and North American offices have been able to take that investment and start to drive forward on individual giving. The UK strategy came together then in response to the global strategy, and we completely aligned ourselves with the growth ambition for individual giving, but also thinking about how we can diversify our restricted fundraising in the UK. There's still a need for some funders to use a UK registered entity to channel funds across. So how do we manage that? And are there new opportunities that we can broker here from the UK that we can pass over to our colleagues on the continent? And one of the key decisions we made at that point in 2023 was that we weren't going to prioritise FCDO as a funder. We could see the way that the world was going, and the opportunities weren't really there for the sorts of programmes that we deliver in the same way, and that we would be looking to focus on corporate partnerships and working with large technical foundations and also private philanthropy to drive that strategy forward. So yeah, in 2024, we were successful in securing investment. And since then, we've been forging ahead with our individual giving plans. One of the key things was to sort of really make sure that we remembered the old phrase that every strategy should have draft written on it, because things change immediately, you write them down. But we had our goals, what we were looking to achieve over the next 6 years. And we also put in some points of review so that we could understand whether we were on track, whether we needed to change any of our approaches to fundraising and pivot in behind new opportunities. And first planned review is at the end of this year, but around the time last year that the cuts in overseas development aid were announced, we immediately went into scenario planning mode at that point and looking at the impact not only on the institutional funding landscape and the trust and foundations landscape, but also the impact more widely on competition for unrestricted and how that might affect our plans and goals. And at that point, we decided we weren't going to reduce our income ambition, but that we were going to pivot behind some new opportunities. So for us on the individual giving side, we saw and started to see some traction in philanthropy that hadn't been apparent when we put the strategy together a couple of years ago. There have been some changes in the board, some changes in relationships and connections with our supporters that had opened up some doors. And so we were able to put more emphasis and effort behind philanthropy, which is really exciting. And we're looking to kick off a campaign imminently. And on the trust and foundation side, we were able to bring on 2 new partners. And that gave us confidence that we were, in fact, working in the right way and taking the right steps to go forward. I think a key thing in this was just recognizing that in a very competitive market, to be fundable, you need to be visible. So we elevated the role of communications in our strategy and our plan, and thinking about more intentionally about positioning and how we can leverage thought leadership opportunities to demonstrate our ability to deliver impact and innovation in healthcare in Africa, and also to drive stronger brand awareness, which has a positive impact on our acquisition campaigns. So yeah, for us, it's about constantly reviewing that plan and making sure that we're on track to deliver that plan. So as part of the execution of the strategy, we implemented an organizational-wide operational plan, which allows us to track key activities. They form part of the risk register that we review on a quarterly basis with our governance and finance subcommittees of the board, giving updates and confidence in terms of where we are on progress towards the strategy and any changes, any new additions or revisions that need to be made, and making sure that the board is aware of how things are changing in uncertain times, but making sure that we can make those decisions quickly. And building in those review points is really, really important. Are we on track? Are we still heading in the same direction? Are we doing the things we said we'd do? If not, why not? What can we do to push something forward that's got stuck, or maybe replace it with a new idea or a new opportunity as it emerges? And that agility is really key. And for us, it's all about testing and learning and making sure that we're able to get behind the things that are working well. So for an example, in our individual giving program, we're using digital and DRTV as our primary channels to recruit new supporters. And that means that we are able in digital to adjust budgets in real time, to pause, to increase our activity as results dictate. And in DRTV, we're never committed more than a month in advance, so we can always sort of pause and reflect and make any changes that we need to. So we have that under control. We're not overcommitted before we get too deep into the year, and we can move budget behind what's working best, which is really important. A key thing, and I think this should, as fundraisers, this is the key to success really. But building trust with our supporters is really, really important. And we really do feel at AmRef that nothing should feel as good as giving does. And how do we make that come alive for our supporters? And I think it helps being a relatively small organisation that we can, do things in a very open and transparent way. We can invite our supporters under the bonnet, as it were, and connect them to our colleagues on the ground and show the real impact of their giving. But it's really important as well to not overlook people who might be, treasure that's hidden deep within your supporter base. We had one mid-level donor who had been giving a higher than average regular gift for a long time. And we reached out to them to sort of say thank you. That's amazing. Why have you been supporting us? And it turns out that they'd been supporting a few other charities in a similar level, but no one had got in touch to ask them about why. And at the end of the last year, they made a 6-figure gift through their business to AmRef. And so stewardship is really, really important, particularly retaining support in a difficult period is really, really important as well. So making sure that you're getting repeat funding from some of those larger funders is key. And so we put a lot of time and effort into making that real. So I guess the key things that we've learned over the time is that plan for change, plan in opportunities to pause, review, course correct, make sure you understand what's working, what's not working, and how can you mobilize behind what is. And I think Stevie made a good point about the fact that sometimes these reviews are there in response to a negative opportunity, but actually there are quite a few positive opportunities that you can be exploring and thinking about how you can maximize those. New approaches are really important. There's a lot of things that feels like we're doing it for the first time at AmRef, but that's only the first time for AmRef, not the first time for UK fundraising or UK charities. There's a lot we can learn from the experience of others, so be open to that, but also be willing to test and accept that not everything you test is going to work. And if you can build trust and confidence with your board and your senior leadership, you can create an environment where every test is not critical, that you can learn something and you can learn what doesn't work, which is just as important as what does. And yeah, finally, that stewardship is key and partnership approaches are really important. There is more value in your existing connections and support base than perhaps you are realizing right now. And if you can go that extra mile, you will stand out from the crowd, and that does get positive response. And there are still enough amazing people out there who care about the causes that we are working to support. We can be encouraged that people still, in these troubling times, want to get behind what we do. And if we can show a little bit of love back to them, then it makes a huge amount of difference. So that's it from me. I'll hand you back.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt. Much appreciated, and some really, really good thoughts in there. I will pass pretty much straight over to Renu now for her part of the session. So Renu, over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Matt, for that really interesting presentation. Lots of questions on my mind already, just to know about your journey, but really good to hear that your story. And so just picking up from where Matt left us off, scenario planning isn't new to many of us here. We've used scenario, even in ChristianAid, we've used scenario planning in multiple ways across the organization. But in most cases, it has been to help us pivot. It's to help us build clarity when we are definitely not certain of what the situation is. So a few years ago, as part of the our midterm review of our 7-year strategy standing together, we decided to pause and take stock and ask ourselves a few questions. One was, are we delivering our strategy well? How has the external environment changed? And what do we need to do to adapt as an organization? Now, we had just come out of a pandemic, which reminded us all that the world can change with the drop of a hat, and we need to be agile and ready to respond to those shocks or changes. And those changes are not just localized, but they have impact at a global level as well. So even though our review wasn't wasn't an afterthought after the pandemic. It just made it came at a time, and it told us for certain that yes, we need to think about where are we as an organization, and also to know that the world's changing rapidly. Civic space is shrinking all around. The environment we operate in is becoming more politically constrained. Funding models are changing, like we just heard, and institutional funding is becoming harder to access and more expensive to manage as well. Perhaps most importantly, there is a growing and legitimate challenge to the role and legitimacy of international INGOs, particularly from civil society in the global south. Therefore, the question for us was not whether the sector will change and how that's changing, but the real question for us was how quickly were we willing to adapt? Now, none of us really know what the future is going to look like. Just the last 2 weeks, the conflicts and volatility we're seeing around is just a reminder of that. But if COVID has taught us anything, it's this, to expect the unexpected. So instead of focusing only on what the most likely future might be or what the future is going to look like, we also asked this question to ourselves was, what role should Christian Aid play in that future, irrespective of what that future looks like? Where would we add the most value as an organization in a changing world? And that question marked the beginning of our transformation journey. So the goal was not just to design a new strategy or a new plan or the next 3-year plan, but it was to really understand the role of Christian Aid, the role Christian Aid should play in the future. So to support this journey, we worked with a consultant who helped us imagine different possible scenarios for us, possible futures for us. And these scenarios were bold. They were intentionally designed to spark discussion and for us to think differently. Some were uncomfortable, some were surprising, but that was exactly the point. These scenarios pushed us to ask, where would Christian Aid matter the most in that world, in a world that was constantly changing, and what that meant for the choices that we were making today, and what would our impact story look like at the end of it? So interestingly, even though the scenarios were very different, a few common themes emerged, and they helped us to see more clearly where Christian Aid is best positioned to contribute. So the answer was not about being something completely different, but it was about being clearer and more intentional about what we already do best as an organization. And that is an organization that champions localization and equitable partnerships, an organization that moves more resources to civil society in the global south, that focuses on a few areas where we can really drive that meaningful change, and one that tells a clearer story about the impact our partners are making. But what it also highlighted for us was that across these scenarios was we really need to change as an organization. We needed to reduce our organizational complexity so that more resources can flow to partners better. And these insights shape the design principles for our new operating model. And this model that would reduce complexity, that focused on strengthening partnerships, that focuses ultimately on our impact, and builds a future-facing organization that can adapt as the world continues to change. So therefore, in practical terms, what that meant was it was becoming a simpler, a leaner organization, one that spends less money on our own operational costs and invests more of that in partnerships that mattered the most. But ultimately, we believe that our local partnerships is what makes us deliver the most sustainable impact for people living in poverty. And that's where we need to invest the most. So therefore, we need to be able to position ourselves in that space as an organization that helps them do their best, where they can shine, where we bring their voices together. So therefore, our role is being more of a catalyst, a convener, a connector in a way, but also simplifying our structures, our ways of working so that we can direct more resources towards the communities we exist to serve, and therefore help us be better stewards of the resources entrusted to us, just as Matt spoke to us about. So now, how do we continue to use scenarios? And scenarios did help us get to this stage, but it didn't stop with just us, developing a model and a plan based on that. We still continue to use scenarios today as well, but more in terms of testing the robustness of our plan, our model, identifying any gaps in our capability and operating model. We also continue to mock up potential situations to test how ready we are as an organization if that was to happen. Do we have the right processes in place? Do we have the right roles and responsibilities in place? Are we clear of what we will do, how we will work with partners within the ecosystem, how we can be more agile? And therefore, what does this mean in terms of our systems and do they need strengthening as well? So, what I would say is ultimately, what scenario planning helped us do was shift our thinking from asking ourselves, how can we protect the organization we are today, to actually ask ourselves something much more important, which is, where does ChristianAid add the most value? Thank you. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Renu. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my video to start off again. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I should add for everybody joining that we were due to have a third speaker this afternoon. Unfortunately, he's been called away due to an urgent matter at work, and he was unable to join us. So it is likely that the session will run a little bit short. But with that, we will move directly into the Q&A part of the session. As I mentioned back at the start, there is a Q&A facility within Zoom, so please do keep your questions coming through on the Q&A. We'll start with one for Matt, which was, can you give some examples of the people actions as part of your scenario planning, please?
Yeah, so the change in roles for our programs team is an interesting one when you think about the transition of program design becoming more central, and with HQ and the country offices and our role changing more as a facilitator of funding questions. So that required some reorganization in the team and some new roles to be created, and also some capability assessments as well to think about training needs and how that could be done. So we've been working with the programs team to make sure that they've got the tools that they need to be able to drive business development in the UK forward, but also to be able to sort of manage the stewardship at a distance and work with stakeholders in the country offices and headquarters. We've also been growing our fundraising team. When I joined, there were 4 in our team managing a warm appeals program and a philanthropy program. We've scaled the team up now so that we're delivering digital and DRTV acquisition. We've invested in our legacy program. We've invested in mid-level and the people that we need to be able to make that happen. So the team has doubled in size over the last 24 months, which has been really important in terms of us being able to take on a growing program. We don't anticipate needing to grow much further. It might be in a couple of years' time, some further roles might be added. But the key things were really just making sure that we had the right people in the right roles, as Renu said, and that those roles were focused on delivering the strategy. And for a small charity, it can be a challenge sometimes to recruit the experience you need. So we've accepted that as part of the deal, that we're going to need to spend a lot more perhaps on training and development than perhaps otherwise might be required. But we really want to build a fundraising asset at AMREF. So we can outsource a few technical elements, but we really want to bring those into the team over time. And so it's really about investing in people. So we're taking people who are quite often in their first job, let alone their first fundraising job, and working with them to develop their skill sets and train them on to become fundraisers of the future. So please do not be trying to poach my team. But that was just a key assumption that when we're going to struggle to attract maybe the level of experience we need. So let's work with some less experienced people who got great talent and commitment, and develop them into the role, and gradually over time reduce our dependence on external sources of expertise.
Thank you, Matt. We've got a great number of questions coming through the Q&A, so please do keep them coming. The next one is that I talked about watching out for optimism bias in assumptions underpinning scenarios, and what's the panel's advice on how best to do that? So, Matt and Renu, would you like to give your thoughts, and that I might share a couple of my own?
I'm happy to go first, and then
Please.
Yeah. So I think for me, it also comes to about how you design your scenarios. So making sure that your scenarios aren't too similar to each other. They're not too close. They're too close to what's happening currently, so that you already know all the answers and you already know it. But it's also about helping you, think about the unexpected, because that's what COVID taught us, wasn't it? Or that's what anything that we've seen since. So it's about really defining. Maybe I would say that if you've developed a scenario, add a sub scenario to it that will disrupt that scenario. So that really helps you think through, some of those other areas that and challenge you in certain spaces. Yeah, but Matt.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, fundraisers are eternal optimists. It's the only way we can keep doing it, I believe. But that does mean that we tend to believe the stories we tell ourselves as well. So we have to be careful about that. So I think one of the key things and one of the important things that we did to avoid getting carried away was to do a thorough piece of market research and really understand our market and be able to benchmark, what different fundraising approaches we're delivering, and then to sort of build a model around that and understand how it goes. And I think as well, it's always good to have plan B and plan C. So, if you're relying on 100% of plan A to work in order to achieve what you need to achieve, you are going to be disappointed at the end of the year or at the end of your strategic period, because things change. Not everything works. You need to know what your fallback options are, and you need to be able to move to them quickly. So again, that thinking through that, I think, is a really important piece, and that helps again to sort of mitigate the sort of optimism that you might get behind your favorite idea. You need to realize that your favorite idea might not be the right idea, and that might be another way, and you need to be ready to switch to that as quickly as you can.
No, completely agree with that, Matt. And I think more widely, quite often having a range of different viewpoints and making sure those viewpoints are heard is really important. I think a couple of other thoughts. One is to look at the trend of actual results versus your scenarios, and if you see that you are constantly ahead or constantly adverse to the scenarios, that may be a suggestion that there's some optimism bias, and therefore you may be looking to correct for the future. I think the other thing that can be helpful, and this is very much coming at it from an accountant and auditor's perspective, is to always have somewhere in the scenario planning of a plausible worst case. So I think it's quite helpful, and particularly for those accountants on the call, one of the things that your auditors, people like me, will ask you about is going concern. And actually, as an audit partner, one of the things I find most helpful is to see a plausible worst case, because if I can see that there's a viability for the organization in that plausible worst case, then actually those kind of more positive scenarios that kind of layer on top of it are much easier to understand. So I do think sometimes reflecting on what would be a worst case is that it doesn't help avoid optimism bias, but it means if there is optimism bias, you have a fallback plan that can be effective.
I'd agree. I'd just say on that my finance director helps me avoid optimism bias on a regular basis. She's very good.
It's often the role of the accountants within the organisation. That's why there's that benefit to a wide range of different views and perspectives. And that actually takes us really neatly into the next question coming from Dan, which is a question for both Matt and Renu. Who did you involve in the scenario planning to ensure a fully rounded perspective and to gather insights on potential external change? So good to get, obviously your finance director, Matt, sounds like it was one of the individuals you involved, but who else did you involve in the process?
Yeah, so we involved our colleagues internationally as well as colleagues in the UK. So we wanted to get a perspective from them on how their world was changing and what, from a UK perspective, we could add value and what the risks and opportunities were in that. But from a UK operation, it was the entire senior leadership team and the senior management team, board of trustees as well. We also worked with our external agencies and suppliers to give us a real read on market conditions, and we engaged consultants to do a piece of market mapping for our restricted fundraising side, and also on the unrestricted side, and thinking about the acquisition challenges, because it's a tough market in the UK. And indeed, there was a point at which, HQ were wondering whether the UK was investable at all, given how difficult it is, to fundraise here in such a crowded space. But we were able to convince them that, we could achieve, ambitious growth despite those conditions. And we've delivered on it, which has been fantastic. But yeah. And also just thinking, in my team, there are people who are subject matter experts and who know how things work that I don't. It's not my job to be the expert on everything. So bringing in specialist expertise at key times to understand trends and developments was really key. So making sure that at all levels of the organisation, there was representation in building those scenarios. And so that when we eventually produced our favourite scenario, the one that we were going to build the plan around, people were bought into it. They played a part in developing it.
Thanks, Matt. And Rena, what about within Christian Aid? Who did you involve?
Yeah, quite similar to Matt. I think we also, had a whole range of stakeholders, from senior leaders, from colleagues both in the UK and also our colleagues in other countries and across the world. But we had a mix of people who, I think back to that first question about optimism bias, who sees the world in a very optimistic way, but also who can see various issues that can come in. So we had them also involved. And then we also did these sessions with our partners as well, because they gave a very different perspective as well to, where Christian Aid was distinctive, how we would support them best. And that helped us define our distinctive offer as well. So yeah, I think, and then our board of trustees as well.
Fantastic. So moving on to the next question for all of us, what tools would you recommend as being most useful for scenario planning? So I guess Rena, did you have any particular tools within Christian Aid you used for scenario planning?
When we came up with scenarios, we as I said, we thought about a range of different scenarios, from starting like, what would it look like if Christian Aid was a completely advocacy organization or a purely grant-making organization? So we thought about different scenarios like that. But then, like, back to your point, Steve, initially, it's not that you shouldn't come up with a whole lot of scenarios. You really need to narrow down to 2 or 3, and then again narrow. And so what we did was we started with, I think, 4, then we came down to 2. We tried various combinations of each as well. And then, subsequently, when we use scenarios, we also think about places of scenarios that would really push us, to beyond our comfort zone as well. So I think those are some of the tools that we've used when we've developed scenarios.
What about you, Matt?
Yes. So I think one of the things that's been most helpful really is just making sure that we had an individual giving model. AMREF hadn't done any acquisition in the sort of 10, 11 years before I joined. So there was no sort of working model understanding the relationships within our supporter base, and let alone any sort of acquisition activity that was built on top of that. So we spent nearly a year building a sophisticated model that allows us to plug in different scenarios and forecast the outcomes. So, when you're talking about like the plausible worst outcome, we always used 3 models: worst case, most likely case, best case. and then sort of understood the differences between them, and what were the key things that would tell us which scenario was playing out. So on that side, that was really important. I think we're always connecting in to like networking. That's very important. So again, learn from the experience of others. They may be seeing things that we're not seeing, or finding opportunities that we hadn't spotted, or struggling with similar issues and finding new solutions to them. So I think that's always good as well. Is not to live in your own echo chamber. Again, you don't want that self-reinforcing conversation going on. You want to kind of break out of that and just sort of, don't be afraid to ask questions and sort of see, how else other people are doing it. So yeah, being open to conversation with those outside your organization, I think, is really key. And again, for small organizations, it can be hard sometimes to break out of that bubble. But it's really important you do and become more externally focused, I think has been really key. So yeah, seminars like this are really useful because they help you to think in new ways, hopefully, which is been really useful.
The other one I would add, and apologies for fitting all sort of stereotypes around external auditors of always looking on the pessimistic side, but a tool I used a few times, particularly within the COVID period, was something called reverse sensitivity analysis. Now, quite often organizations will use sensitivity analysis that you'll say, well, our individual giving is up 5%. So what does this mean for our model, of our cost base, or it's down 5%? What does that mean? Reverse sensitivity analysis, you're starting almost from the other perspective of what does it take to break our model? So actually, if we had a 10% drop in individual giving, does that break our model? No. Okay, so actually, if we had a 20% drop, does that break the model? Well, yes, because actually then you start to understand where you need to be considering those worst case scenarios. And actually, in some cases, organizations found it quite helpful because they could see, well, actually, it takes an awful lot to break our model. And if it takes an awful lot, then actually we can progress with some confidence and some optimism. For others, where things were very, very, very sensitive, it meant that there had to be a lot more kind of granular consideration around the assumptions and around the way they were coming up with those scenarios. So I found that quite helpful. I mean, more generally, most of my clients will use some kind of Excel model for scenario planning. There are various tools. There are increasing numbers of tools that use some sort of AI basis to support with that, but often a lot of them tend to be kind of good old-fashioned Excel type models. Moving on, we've got another question from Matt, which is, what challenges and benefits did you experience in moving the grants and contracts fundraising from Europe and North America to Africa?
It's an ongoing process. We haven't completed it. Like I say, some funders still require a UK registered entity to channel funds through, so there's not going to be a point, I think, where we're 100% there. But a key part of it is understanding the capability and capacity of colleagues to be able to manage the stewardship piece. So we are working closely with the countries that we've been funding over the last few years to sort of think about how we can make those introductions and transition those relationships over, and also to sort of advise on, donor preferences, how they like to be communicated with it. So there's a lot of handover, and that's quite complicated because it's case by case. There isn't a one size fits all thing. So that's quite difficult. I think the other challenge is sort of thinking like the paradigm shift. We're not the ones driving the strategy. We're not the ones driving the funding opportunities. We're responding now in a more intentional way to the priorities as they're given to us by the countries that we're working with, and then thinking about how does the UK add value to that. So that mind shift has been it's taken a while to sort of get our head around what does that look like, and how do we make that happen. And also just sort of thinking about a change in skill set, about being more entrepreneurial, and thinking about how you can become, as I say, more visible in the networks, in the conferences, in the platforms or whatever that you need to find these funders in, which, hasn't necessarily been, a strength of our programs team in the past. It wasn't something that they were being asked to do, particularly to sort of play that ambassadorial, not quite sales, but building that kind of role. So that's been a challenge, but people, are adapting well. Like I said, we've supported them with training, toolkits. We're trying to create the opportunities to give people the space to be out and focus externally rather than sort of being, working from home or whatever, and sort of trying to drive relationships by email. That's really not the most successful way. So how do we, empower them to be able to do that and give them confidence to get out there and do that? So, like I say, it's a work in progress. Some donors are really up for it and really want to make that transition quickly. Some are hesitant, and some, for structural reasons, need that UK entity, as part of their policy. But and so we're sort of finding that balance. But it's happening, and it's happening faster than perhaps we've predicted in our model, our strategy. But that's because the world has changed, rapidly, much faster than we've expected it to. So it's only right that we try and speed up in our response.
Thank you very much. So the next question we've got is, thank you to Matt and Renu. Your experiences are really helpful as we go through similar processes. How did your organisations and senior management team get buy-in from staff, and how did you bring them along with you, particularly when there's so much anxiety and uncertainty around job loss? Renu, do you want to kick off on that one first, and then we'll hand over to Matt?
Sure. Yeah, I think, all change is hard, and I think that's the starting point, is that, it's hard for everybody who's involved in it. So I think empathy is a very good start. So with that, I would say being honest, being transparent about where you are from the get-go. I think, at ChristianAid, we did try to be honest upfront about where we were, starting from the midterm review to the choices that we made then, to talk about where we were going, but also to being honest that we didn't have all the answers at the start. So I think that's important, is that, you need to be able to tell your staff members that. And then secondly, to be very clear about the rationale of why you're changing. What is it that's, making that happen? And also, I would say, try and find ways to have more conversations. You have to be more accessible to staff, to help them understand, to help them, just vent, grieve, mourn. But finally, there are going to be changes for the organization, isn't it? And you have to therefore make sure that your staff leave well, and they feel like they've been able to, if they are going to leave well, but also, and for those who are in your journey, with the journey again, to walk with them as well. So I would focus on these three things.
Matt, do you have anything else to add on that?
I think finding feedback opportunities is really important. So I think, we can, as a leadership team, broadcast our message, but we also need to be open to hearing what's coming back the other way and creating mechanisms to do that. So whether they are anonymous or in plenary, but being open to that. And Renu, you're right. You have to be available. You have to be accessible. You have to realise that you're going to need to say this more than one time for people to actually sort of digest it and deal with it, process it. So it's communication. But as Renu said, understanding the rationale is key, and walking people through the decisions, the key decisions, and why you've arrived where you've arrived at. Now, it might be a decision that they don't support or wouldn't have made, but this is where we're at as an organisation, and people can choose to sort of come with you or not. But I think that openness and accountability, and creating those feedback opportunities, because you may have missed something as well whilst you're sort of thinking through something. So having that is key. But yeah.
Thank you both, and thanks everybody for so many great questions. We've got some really interesting questions, so please do keep them coming. So for the next one, we've got a question for each of you. So for Matt, being Africa led in your organisation, do you have executive leadership based in Nairobi too? We're an organisation currently working out how to shift executive leadership from UK through to countries of operation.
Yeah, our headquarters have always been in Nairobi since we started. So originally it was started by some European and North American doctors flying over to Kenya, and then deciding to use aircraft to reach people in remote places. But the organisation has transformed hugely over the last 15 years, particularly, and so our leadership is entirely African now, based out of Nairobi. Some fantastic people. I was fortunate enough to go and meet them a couple of years ago when I joined AMREF, and just visionary expertise, fantastic, sort of driving the organisation forward. And I think the key thing I think that I really have confidence in with them is their anticipatory leadership. They're thinking ahead, and they're not just thinking a month ahead, a year ahead. They're thinking 5 years, 10 years ahead to where the organisation needs to be, and about how to make that happen. And yeah, there can be challenges with time zones and with sort of cultural differences or whatever, but actually I think we have a really good working relationship with them. And there's a really clear line of reporting from the UK into HQ, and how the UK board and the international board come together, and how those representation changes. And I've worked in organizations where they've been really pleased that the global strategy aligns with our strategy. It's not how it's meant to be. Aligning and making sure you're aligned is really, really important. And we're just taking that leadership from the centre has been something that I've been really impressed with at AMREF, and the sort of collegiate, collaborative way of working has been really helpful. We recognise there are all challenges, and that there's more than one way to sort of combat those, mitigate those, and working together internationally has been really easy, actually. I've found it really refreshing. To none of the politics that maybe you get in some of these sort of multinational organisations that maybe I've experienced in larger ones before. It's been really open, honest, and really clear. And yeah, the fact that last year was a shock to the organisation, but the strategy had almost anticipated that shock was going to come. Just when it came was a surprise. So we were already in a place to kind of fix it, and I think that's really impressive.
Thank you, Matt. And for Renu, how do you balance protecting the organisation to change and being future focused when resources are limited? And what did you find were the trade-offs in that process?
Sure. I think from my experience, I can say that it's about, acknowledging that you can't do everything. You really need to be focused about what you deliver, and both in terms of the future, but also in terms of what you're doing while you're going through the change. Because it's not just about the resources that in terms of funding that's limited, but it's also the people resources, because it's almost often that the same people are involved in change while they're delivering business as usual. So I think being extremely being cognizant about that. What we did was we often do an annual planning process every year, so that helped to think about what are our priorities. But then in the mid of that year, we did another exercise to say, do these priorities still stand true? Of these, what are really critical? What is good, and what can really, what should we really stop? And I think the problem with most organizations is that we don't know when to stop. We tend to do much more. So I think having those honest conversations and saying and acknowledging that, yes, we can't focus on everything is important, and equally important in the future as well, because resources are going to be limited, going forward. And I think that's what our scenario planning taught us, is we really need to be distinctive of what we can do versus what others can do and what we bring into the system. And I think even as we think about the future, it's about, we don't have to be there. We have amazing partners. So let partners have more space, and let us go back into a role that enables that change. So I think that's the shift that we've made in the future, and that's the shift you have to continuously make as well. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So the next question we've got is, how did you balance the strategy for recruiting and building up capacity of less experienced staff versus immediate delivery needs and targets, and any tips of how you balance those two things?
Yeah, so the board was really sure that they wanted to build an asset in the AMREF fundraising team, and knew that it was going to take a while to do that. And in the short term, that we would need to rely on external expertise to do that as well. So we made sure that we had the right partners. And we made sure that when we contracted those partners, that building capacity internally was part of the deal, so that they would be doing the workshops and the training with our team as we went along, and showing them the ropes as we went. So yeah, I mean, it means that the pace of growth initially perhaps wasn't as fast as it might have been, but we were prepared to be patient. And I think the key thing is that it's a part of that, I guess, almost like sustainability planning, thinking at some point we can make that transition and reduce our dependence on external agencies, take that whole fee element out of our budgets going forward, I mean, to a greater or lesser extent, and have a strong team of people who are technically adept and are supported with the tools internally to be able to deliver that. So yeah, it was a conscious decision from the board to say, actually, you know what, don't just build something that's based on external agencies forever. Build, plan to create a scenario where you can build capability internally.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Matt. And that probably actually links quite neatly into the next question, which is that you mentioned getting investment for the UK fundraising approach. Where did that investment come from?
So we got a transformational gift from Mackenzie Scott just towards the end of COVID. So HQ received that, and it was given with the intention of strengthening AMREF and making it a more sustainable organisation going forward. And so there were some decisions made about how that was going to be used, but around half of it was ring-fenced to support the strategy around individual giving. And so it's a revolving fund, basically. So we get 3 years funding to top up our unrestricted balance to be able to use that to grow a team, build, contract with the agencies, and then go and deliver the program. And we'll be paying that back over the next 4 years as well. So that revolving fund then is just managed HQ, and ourselves, Italy, Netherlands, Germany, Nordic, France now, they've all received investment from that pot. They're all growing their programs. They're all now paying back into that fund. So the next tranche of offices will get the opportunity to apply for investment and, have that extra firepower to make the step change in their programs. So yeah, it was very fortunate that we, came to the attention of Mackenzie Scott. But I think, again, some really wise thinking about how to use that fund as a multiplier across the organisation.
No, thank you very much for that, Matt. And a question for Renu. Did the change result in focusing on fewer types of programs with partners, or was there flexibility built into the strategy in terms of being dependent on context and being locally led?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yes.
So it was a bit of both, I would say. Definitely, as I was mentioning, we started with a midterm review, and what that showed us was that we were focusing on too many things. So we definitely first started by narrowing down the themes that we wanted to work in. So we focused on a set of themes that we would work in. And then the other thing I think what we learned was you could also start to build in some of those changes as you're going through the process. So we, as an organization, made the decision to stop all direct implementation work and to work only with partners, because we didn't, we wanted to steward our resources well, and also make that extra space for partners and not be in that space where we are encroaching into their work. And even going forward, I would say one of the clear things that came out of us having a distinctive offer is to be really clear about what we are doing. And as I said, vis-a-vis what partners are doing. So we are defining those niche areas for us alongside our partners. We're having those open conversations with them to say, what is it that they think we do best? Where can we support them? And so what we've come up with, we're trying to come up with a set of clear offers that CushionAid would work on. And then the next level, what we're currently doing is to think about what that stuff mean in different contexts, because what we don't want is the one size fits all, because the context everywhere is so different. So that's the other thing that we did. And then also, but also not planning for 100%. So making sure that there's enough space for us to be able to be innovative, to respond to, the changing landscapes, to respond to new opportunities, to try and work out what is it that in a context, if there's an opportunity to do something great, let's be able to focus on that as well. And in all of it, I would say it is for us to work with partners and be and drive locally led change. So I don't see them as separate, like they're together. And that was the underlining thing across all our programming. And that's why we also stopped our direct implementation work. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a few practical questions that I'll take on sort of as a bit of a group. So are we able to share the slides? Yes, I would assume that's fine. We haven't within the pack had a slide on reverse sensitivity analysis, but I have one I prepared earlier, so I can let Bond have that to be shared with the slides as well. It's one I prepared to explain the position during COVID. There's also a sort of slightly more kind of practical question about the type of training is effective and where can we find toolkits? I mean, actually, there is a reasonable amount online that you can use. Some of the various sector bodies, such as NCVO, do have a number of guides and toolkits. So I would actually start with looking at some of the online resources as well. I don't know, Matt or Renu, if you have any sort of particular things that you direct people to, but some of the NCVO resources I've seen in the past have been very, very helpful. So I would often use them as a starting point. Question for Matt, which is, can you give some examples of the ways which AMREF has made itself more visible to funders?
Yeah, so it's a work in progress. We're 1 year into the plan, but so I think the channels we use to market has been really important, and actually maximizing our presence within them. So we've gone from a very low cadence social media platform sort of approach to monthly campaigns, paid, boosted, as well as organic, Google advertising. Really maximizing the opportunities for that. We're obviously on TV now, and that's made a huge difference in terms of reach into our audiences. So from an individual giving side of things, we are way more visible than we were before. We're also exploring brand and media partnerships to help us go that extra bit, because as a relatively unknown organization in the UK, trust being the most important element of fundraising, we need to sort of think about ways where we can sort of get that endorsement from a trusted brand already and make that work. So that's a piece of work that we're looking at now for the next couple of years' work. Otherwise, on the thought leadership space, it's really just making sure that we are in the spaces where our funders would expect us to be, and that we're not just being a delegate, that we're bringing content, that we're looking for speaking opportunities, that we're hosting sidebar events, etc., so that we can network more effectively, and also sort of leveraging expertise in key publications and journals, but also in the quality press and the broadsheets particularly. We've got to a point now where we're kind of like a go-to on African health matters with some of those big papers, and that's great. We were never there 2 years ago. We were sort of running around chasing opportunities, but now they're coming to us, and with BBC and a few others as well. So that's been an exciting change, but it's greater than the sum of its parts. As you keep doing it, more opportunities arrive, and then you increase the visibility. So again, I think I mentioned it a few times, but becoming more externally focused has been a real shift. There's no point us being a best kept secret only known to us and a few friends. We need to be out there, and we need to be in the spaces where the people that we want to influence are. And so, yeah, like I say, we're still on the way to it, but we've made some real progress over that in the last sort of 18 months.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. The next question we've got is about the right moments for using scenarios. So Matt and Renu both mentioned using midpoint strategy reviews and key external events, but are there any others? I'll kick off with one thought, and then I'll pass to Renu and to Matt. So where I'm a trustee, one of the things that we've done is sort of said, if our reserves either go below a certain level, or we forecast that in the near future the reserve will go below that level, then that has been the trigger for us to do a couple of things. One is to invoke our organizational change policy, and the second is to invoke some of the scenarios that we've been modelling as well. So we use the reserves level. Reserves in our context is very much equivalent to cash. We don't have anything sort of too complex on our balance sheet, but we've used that as our trigger. I don't, Rena or indeed Matt, if you have anything to add in terms of other moments to consider.
The only thing I would add is, I mean, yeah, you're right. We have most often used it when, we've had an external event or we're at a midpoint. But the other thing that we continue to use it is also to, when we feel like there's a certain uncertainty, there's a certain vagueness of our operations, and we don't know where we really need to be pivoting to, or how, are there gaps in our processes? That's again when we start to mock up some scenarios and to test our own readiness, because I think that's what scenario planning helps, is to test your readiness to events. So you don't really need to wait for an external event. You can constantly be testing it to know if you are ready as an organization. Yeah, so that's the only thing I would add.
The only thing that I would add to that is, like there's degrees of detail that you can go into in scenario planning, and it's whether you want to do a huge piece or not. But I feel that every time you get into annual planning, you're already again checking where you are against the progress that you said you'd made in the strategy, and are you on track or not, and what needs to shift next year to make that happen. And also, in a more positive way, what's doing better than you thought was going to do, and how do you get behind that in a way that you hadn't thought about. For our plan to execute the strategy, we're pulling forward a few things that we'd expected to do in a couple of years' time, just because of the way that the circumstances have worked out. So, I'm a guy who likes a plan to be the plan, but I'm learning to think on my feet a little bit more and adapt. And there are positive moments where you can say, actually, how do we do more of this? And your annual planning cycle is just a really good place to sort of do a very simple check of progress against goals, and what do you need to push harder, what do you need to stop, what do you need to do more of, what's new that you can bring.
Thanks, Matt. And we've got a few questions. So we've got 3 or so more questions that we'll look to cover off before we wrap up. So another question for Matt is that can you share a bit about how UK-based supporters perceived and decided to support a Southern headquartered organisation? At our organisation, we've got a similar model with our headquarters in Bangladesh for the last 50 years, and had a very similar experience of leadership anticipating change as well in advance. So how does that translate into the donor journey, Matt?
Yeah, so I think you have to think about which audiences you're communicating to. And, there's still, quite a traditional audience that's more interested in the human story than the organization story. But for some segments, the organization story is really important. And I think, we see it as it's obviously not an entirely unique USP, but it is a point of difference with other large international organizations to have that leadership, based there, and to always have had that. It does make a difference. Now, some people can see potential issues with that. Some people can see the opportunities in that. And I think you just need to be ready for both scenarios. And, I'm sure you have those sorts of conversations on a regular basis. But for our major donors, particularly, and certainly for some of our institutional or restricted funders, it's a really important thing that actually, that we're led from where we are led. And our leadership is as strong as it is, and it can really work to our advantage, I think, sometimes, especially with the localization agenda and the decolonialization of aid, and sort of putting, demonstrating that the leadership is coming from the right place, that the global strategy is coming from the right place. It's not being led by another agenda. These are African solutions developed by Africans for Africans is really, really important. And our role is to support that, not to drive it, lead it, shape it even. We can reflect on how that impacts on how we do what we do here, but our role is to really respond to that and support it. So I think it's useful. But yeah, you're going to get both conversations, good and challenging. you just got to be ready for them. And you know, I firmly believe that our structure is the right one for AMREF.
And a moment ago, Matt, you mentioned unrestricted funding. Under your model, is the UK funded only by unrestricted funding, or are the UK costs covered by a mixture of restricted and unrestricted funding?
Yeah, so mostly unrestricted, but we do generate cost recovery on our restricted funds, and that largely pays for our programs team. So yeah, we cover it both ways, but yeah, the focus now, as I say, is to sort of to lead them and really push behind unrestricted as the vehicle for growth.
Thanks, Martin. The question for Renu is, what do you think is the best way to run the scenario planning process, and how long should the whole process take?
Sure. I think what's important is what you're getting out of the scenario planning. So I think that's the start of it, because the scenario planning is not the end in itself. It's, you know, it's defining where you want to go. So I think having that is very critical. Secondly, I think it should be really quick, because it should help inform decision making. So be very clear about who you're engaging, when you're engaging, why you're engaging them, and then how the insights feed into your next part of the process, because it sits within a larger process. It sits within either your strategy development or your pivots that you're making. So I would think that, I mean, the one thing that you definitely need is you should not get fatigue steep in, because any change process is hard. So yeah, it should also help people be inspired, think outside the box. So I think that's the kind of emotions and that's the kind of energy you want to drive. So therefore, keep it quick, keep it short, and move on to your next activity.
Yeah, I think that's really important, that sometimes there is a risk that scenario planning becomes the whole activity rather than a tool to support the activity. So I think it's long enough that you're able to make a good, sensible set of decisions, but then beyond that, do it quickly, move on, and then revisit it later if you have to. But I think sometimes there's a risk it becomes the whole organization is kind of paralyzed a bit in scenario planning. We've got one final question, which is for Matt, which is, how would you approach a corporation that has previously supported a charity operating in the same sector as yours? Any advice on that?
Yeah, how would I answer that? I think, you know, you first of all need to see if there's room for another relationship, you know, and like be really, you know, I think doing your research is really helpful before you get close to that, and then thinking about how you can make that approach through a mutual connection rather than as a cold walk up, I think is really, really important. That's going to move things a lot faster. So I think, yeah, do your research, do your due diligence, understand if there is, you know, ambition behind their philanthropy or their CSR or whatever to sort of do more and grow more, whether there's room for you. And then, yeah, how are you connected through a trusted intermediary to make that approach as positive as it can be? And then, yeah, be ready for the conversation to go either way. But yeah.
Thank you very much. So we've gone through everybody's questions, and thank you very much to everybody. So firstly, Renu and Matt, thank you very much for taking the time to share your experiences. I think some really helpful comments, and I hope some really helpful perspectives that the audience will be able to take away into their own organizations. Thank you for all of those who've joined this afternoon, for taking part of the time out of your day to listen, and thank you for so many really great and helpful questions as well. There were some really sort of interesting and sort of interesting questions and really interesting discussions that have come through that. And then finally, thank you very much to the Bond team for setting up the webinar today, and also for your sort of collaboration in the event. It's much appreciated. So well, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and wish you a great rest of your day.